Yes, here we are. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this program by Studium Generale of the Eindhoven University of Technology. Welcome, everyone here in the audience, in the Blauwe Zaal, here on campus, but also a very welcome to everyone who is watching the live stream. In recent weeks, the conflict in Afghanistan dominated the news. The takeover of power by the Taliban and also the very chaotic evacuations we saw. But today, we go back to the month of May, to that other never-ending conflict. And that conflict is, of course, the struggle between the Israelis and the Palestinians. In May, we saw another escalation of this conflict, and maybe you also remember the images in the news, the rockets flying over from Gaza to Israel, and also the bombing by Israel on Gaza. It's a conflict that sparks heated discussions and also a lot of protests worldwide, but it's also a very complicated and very complex conflict. To give you more insight and to better understand what this is all about and to better understand the current situation, we've invited Tjeerd Ritmeester and to discuss the many details and the many aspects of this conflict. Tjeerd Ritmeester works at the Klingendaal Institute, and he's an expert on international relations, on economic diplomacy and economic security. And today in this program he will explain all the difficulties. We also have extra time for questions today, so we have 20-minute extra time for questions at the end as a sort of after talk. Of course, if you have questions, you can raise them, and you can raise them online in the chat, and you can raise them here in the Blauwe Zaal just by raising your hand. And it will be an interactive session today, so please already go to menti.com, so get your mobile phone or anything else, and go to menti.com. Well, the Israel-Palestinian conflict, where it all began and where it is heading to. Please your attention for Tjeerd Ritmeester.
Thank you, guys. Can you all hear me fine? That's good? Perfect. Well, thank you for the great introduction. You basically stole my whole introduction, so now I have to think about what I still have to say. No, so my name is Tjeerd Ritmeester. I work at the Klingendaal Institute in The Hague. Are you familiar with the Klingendaal Institute? No, I've seen some questions here and there. The Klingendaal Institute is a think tank and academy on international affairs. We work with diplomats from all over the world. We train them, and we also do a lot of research. I'm more on the academic part of the organization. And yes, like Gijs said, today we're going to talk about the Israel and Palestine conflict, the never-ending conflict, question mark, is it? It sometimes feels like that. In the photo, you already see a photo from, what happened last May. The conflict escalated again. But before we really go into detail what happened there, where this conflict is heading to, like Gijs has also said, I will first take you to Mentimeter, because I have a few questions for you as well. So let's see if this helps. It's not showing. So waiting for the Mentimeter is not showing, so not on the screen. How do I do that? So yeah, well, this is a technical university, so this is the reason why I'm not studying here. Oh, I understand. It's probably because you have to do the present button, right? Yes. Magic. Yeah, so the first question is pretty simple. We also, hopefully, during the question, the answers are already popping up. But what is the first word that comes into mind when you think about this conflict? So just one word, it can also be two words, I don't care that much. But just the first word or the first concepts that you think of when you think about this conflict. Falafel, actually very interesting, because both parties claim falafel is theirs. When I train with diplomats from Israel and Palestine, I don't try to say it's your dish. Jews, Muslim, hopelessness, I think as well. Geloof, belief. Jews is still the big one. Religion, very happy that that is mentioned a lot, because that will also be part of the presentation today. Holocaust. Well, basically, that's a big reason in the end why many Jews wanted to have their state. And I see a lot of terms about the history, actually, about what is going on there. So a lot of different answers, but also, and I see it disappearing here and there, complex, complicated, very important as well. Thank you for your answers here. I'm still seeing it's changing and moving, but I have to move on because I have to say a lot. So the next question I have for you is, I feel comfortable expressing my opinion or my views about this conflict. True? False? Many answers. I will take a little bit of time here also to give the people online the opportunity to answer. Don't know, no opinion is also big, which is good. Perfect. Well, I'm very happy to see that in this room many people feel comfortable expressing their view about this conflict. Internationally, this is not something what the current polls are pointing out to. Most people who are talking about this conflict, definitely the people involved in this conflict, feel less and less comfortable talking about it. It's also a big reason why I'm standing here actually today, because of this whole sensitivity. I will go more into detail about that later on, but while the answers are still there, while the answers are still popping up, it's good to keep that into mind. But very happy that all of you feel, or most of you, I have to say, feel comfortable. I expect a peaceful agreement or steps towards a peaceful agreement in the coming 5 years. Well, I think I already see where this answer is heading to. Most of you are not very hopeful that in the coming years we will come to a peaceful solution or are making good steps towards a peaceful solution. Personally, I am in the true side. So I do believe in the coming 5 years, I'm not saying there will be already the big peace agreement there, but I think we will take meaningful steps. And during this presentation, I'm going into detail with you why I think so, how that is done. I don't think, even if I give the people online the time to answer this, I don't think this will change very much. So now back to the presentation. Let's see. Yes, perfect. So now I can study here, I did it. The Mentimeter we did. So yes, like I said, we see worldwide that many people are not comfortable anymore talking about this conflict, including myself, and this is a problem. I also see it with other academics, I see it with other researchers. There is a sense of, well, that was one of the words that came by in the first question, but hopelessness. We saw it also in the last round of violence. So in May, tensions in Israel and Palestine escalated again, but not just there. Also here on the streets in Europe, the United States, even here in the Netherlands, even here in Eindhoven, there was a big protest. And we see that those protests are becoming more and more emotional, but also sometimes more and more violent. Put also a photo there of a Jewish restaurant in Amsterdam that is, well, quite symbolic because it's attacked. It has been regularly attacked. But we also see that both sides of the cars are more and more claimed by more conservative or more extreme groups. So we see far-right groups, for example, which is strange because many of them are sometimes quite anti-Semitic, but they claim the Israeli side here in Europe or also in the United States. And we see that sometimes very radical left-wing groups or Islamic groups are also claiming the Palestinian side. And this makes a constructive debate or a constructive discussion difficult. And why is that important? Because this is a very complicated conflict. And I actually embrace that complexity, because that complexity shows that both sides make mistakes, both sides also have rightful claims. And when acknowledging that, when focusing on that complexity, when we can openly talk about that, when we can openly discuss about that, we can also hopefully come to a more peaceful solution in the end, or at least create a healthy discussion or environment for debate and discussion. So that is what I'm going to talk with you about today. So through the perspective of what happened a few months ago and its direct aftermath, so all the way to today, we are going to answer the question, why is it so difficult for Israel and Palestine to come to peace? And where is this conflict heading to? I also know it's still a sensitive topic. It always has been a sensitive topic. So I understand if many of you ask, maybe sometimes I say something that can be for you controversial, or you have a question right away. I will answer all questions, but please by the end, because I have a lot to say and I don't have a lot of time. So please give me the time to come to the end of the debate. When we talk about the origins of this conflict, or at least where this conflict is heading to, it's important to look at what it looks like, well, today. I'm going to use this, so I could use, yes. Well, you don't really see it. I don't even see it myself. So these pictures here on the left, so these two pictures are what Israel and Palestine are basically today, right? So the green area is Israel. The red area here is Gaza, where Hamas is in control, which is currently fully blockaded by Israel. And the area in blue, I'm definitely not used to this thing, but is the Westbank, which is under control of the Palestinian Authority and Fatah. Well, semi-control, because the really blue areas are under full Palestinian control, of the Palestinian Authority, I have to say. The lightish blue areas are under mixed control, so both Israel and Palestine, and the really light areas are under full Israeli control or occupation, and where the Israeli settlements are. When you look at this map, you feel, or you start to sense a little bit also the emotion, particularly on the Palestinian side, right? I mean, you see the occupation, you see where land, sometimes they feel they are losing land, they don't have a lot of control, so you get that. But at the same time, when you look at this picture, you also, if you know a little bit about the origins of this conflict, you also sense the Israeli point of view, because that is mainly about security, securing the safety of Israel as a Jewish state and the Israeli people. Where this comes from, so why Israel is doing all of this and why it feels so insecure, well, it's clearly more powerful than the Palestinians, we have to look at the origins of this conflict. I'm not going to do a 2 hours presentation on the whole origins, but just a really short history. So I'm going to forget a lot of things I probably should mention, but already apologize for that. Many commenters who want to explain the origins of the conflict use these 4 maps. You probably saw them already online or in online debates. When you see these maps, these are wrong, very wrong, or at least they give a wrong impression. So when you see this online, please go to a better website. Why is it wrong? Well, first of all, because if you look on the map on the left, you see Palestine in the green, and it seems to suggest Palestine was already a country or some kind of a nation before Israel was created. It was not. We started a discussion with saying Palestine was first a province of the Ottoman Empire, it was later on part of the British Empire, but even more important, Palestinians were part of a bigger, wider Arab community, which you don't really clearly see on this map. And this wider Arab community, just like the Jews who came from Europe, or some of them were already there for many centuries even, but most of those Arabs also wanted to have their own state, a bigger Arab state or many different Arab states. And when Israel was created, this explains why Israel was right away attacked, not just in conflict with just the Palestinians, but with many Arab countries at the same time. It also explains why throughout the 20th century, Israel was never in conflict with just the Palestinians, but with many Arab countries at the same time. And this also explains a little bit why Israel in this region feels so unsafe. And this sense, this emotion of insecurity grew and grew over time. It also explains why Israel answered this emotion with more and more security measures, which also became more and more extreme. The highlight of this, or well, the dieptepunt, was actually after 1973. You know what happened in 1973? Not the Six-Day War. Which war? Yom Kippur War, exactly. Israel was attacked in surprise by several Arab countries. Israel was almost defeated. And this really, from that point on, we really see that Israel started to invest a lot in its military, in its security policies, and basically everything that had to do with, well, defense. And from this time on, we also see that all those other parts of the occupation, what we are seeing here, are escalating. It explains why the occupation is basically never ending, but also the settlements, because believe it or not, in the beginning they were relatively small, very small even. They were even accepted because Israel felt, well, how more land we have and how more land we control there, the more secure we are. But we see in this, well, in this emotion of feeling insecure or feeling unsafe, frustration grew as well. Throughout more and more militarization, more the sense of more insecurity. And in this frustration, more extreme and radical groups also took over. They had their own interest. Settlements grew, the whole occupation grew, and the status quo, as we know it today, was basically born. On the Palestinian side, we see something similar. This frustration there, so throughout the 20th century, we see that this sense of Palestinian national identity started to grow as well. So not just part of an Arab community, but really a Palestinian national identity. And yes, the Palestinians started to lose a lot of land. But not just losing land, they also got into more socio-economic problems. There were a lot of Palestinian refugees in Palestine itself, but also throughout the Middle East, with a lot of problems. And they grew frustrated as well. And at the same time, we see that support of the Arab country, which was so natural in the beginning, started to dwindle. Even Egypt and Israel reached a peace agreement. Israel eventually even got a peace agreement with Jordan as well. And in this frustration, also more and more radical groups on the Palestinian side took over. So while we see more and more the formation of a clearer Palestinian state, or at least more structures that can eventually become a Palestinian state, we also see more and more radical violence and more radical groups. Explains why even a terror organization like Hamas, even today, can still control Gaza. But more about Hamas later on. This endless cycle of frustration on both sides is also what happened and which is often causing problems today. Also a few months ago in May. The situation in May started in Jerusalem, where unfortunately a lot of, beautiful city by the way, but where unfortunately a lot of conflicts are starting now. And what happened there was Jerusalem is under full control by Israel. Both sides, for both sides, it's a very important city. And in East Jerusalem, most Palestinians live. By far, the majority is Palestinian, also real Palestinian nationals. And what happened there was a wide ring of very conservative Israeli group of settlers. They claimed Palestinian property. They said, we can prove that before all this conflict started, it was actually Jewish property. The Israeli court said, you are right. Palestinian families were evicted out of their homes. And this caused protest, which eventually escalated into, well, the war we saw in May. I will definitely talk more about that because this, I saw religion was one of the big answers you said in the first question, but this brings us to the religious dimension. Because the real conflict actually didn't start around those properties, but it started on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount, I hear birds, I'm not sure. Oh, sorry, your turn. So it started on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is important to both sides as well. So this is the place where the famous Al-Aqsa Mosque is, very important for Muslims. For Jews, important as well, because it's the place where the Second Temple was, or at least even some remains still are, like the Western Wall. But it is also symbolic. It brings us back to that frustration part, because it's the same area where not just the conflict in May started, but also where the Second Intifada started. So you all recognize, or maybe some of you recognize the older man in the upper photo, which is, no, Ariel Sharon, former Prime Minister of Israel. Back then, he was opposition leader in Israel, and he thought it was a good idea to go and walk on the Temple Mount, which was not done because it was under Palestinian control, and Israeli politicians walking there on the Temple Mount close to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, well, not done. And he knew this. So it was clearly an action to provoke. And it happened. He provoked the Palestinians, and it resulted into a second intifada. Of course, this is not the only cause for the second intifada, but this is what we know today as, or what we see as the starting point at least. And in the second intifada is symbolic because this is where a lot of suicide attacks happened on Israel. There was a lot of violence. Many civilians were attacked. So this, again, is symbolic also for Israel because it remembers them of that really unsafe, violent period. For the Palestinians as well, because also for them, they faced a lot of conflict, a lot of violence in Palestinian city. And of course, they remember this is when Ariel Sharon walked on our Temple Mount, where this is so important for us. So again, the sense we are losing land or something very important. But it's also important because it's that holy place. And when you start a conflict, or when a conflict starts on the Temple Mount, you're not just enraging Muslims, or you're not just enraging Palestinians in Palestine. And not all Palestinians are Muslims, but you're not just enraging them. You're enraging today Muslims all over that world, all over the world. And we see that religious identity, the importance of religious identity, is growing fast. And it makes, well, discussion difficult because more radical groups are taking over. They're claiming we are right, they are wrong, they have their own interest. And we see that Islamic governments, Islamic groups are claiming more the side. Where first we had that big Arab banner, now we see a wider Islamic banner on the Palestinian side. But this is also happening on the Jewish side. So in Israel we see that also there, which was not the case before, not that much at least, that more and more religious groups are taking control as well, are getting more influence over the conflict and where it's heading to. So for example, we see that with the settlements. We see that with how this conflict started. And to the religion, it's obvious that you answer that as something you relate to this conflict, but that was not always the case, but it is becoming really more and more important today. And political groups are making use of that tension. I already used the example of Sharon, but in this conflict a few months ago, it was Hamas who used it, because it was Hamas who started provocations on specifically the Temple Mount. Why did Hamas do that? Because Hamas is in Gaza, right? It's not in the West Bank. Well, that's a little bit the problem for Hamas. It's just in Gaza at the moment. And the Palestinian disunity, so Hamas controlling Gaza, Fatah and the Palestinian Authority controlling the West Bank, is a problem. It's a problem for the peace, negotiations, because if you talk with Fatah, if you talk with the West Bank, if you make an agreement with the West Bank, are you also making an agreement with Hamas and Gaza? Well, probably not, so that's already a problem. But they also see, because this problem started in 2006, this was the time when the last Palestinian elections were held, which was won by Gaza. They weren't able to form a stable government. Hamas and Fatah got together into a conflict, a big conflict. Hamas took over Gaza, and eventually, well, Hamas was still still trying to gauge war with Israel, was fully blockaded, and this is how basically the whole blockade of Gaza started. But this resulted, of course, also in a lot of political tensions between Gaza and Hamas. So the Palestinians are far from united, which is a problem for the peace negotiations, what we just mentioned, but also for the Palestinians themselves. Because no one of us, I think, really wants to live in Gaza for obvious reasons. And we see that those political tensions are also growing in Gaza and on the West Bank. So, for example, we see that the popularity of Hamas on the Gaza before this conflict was going down fast. We see that the popularity of Fatah and the Palestinian Authority on the Hamas on the Gaza and Palestinian Authority on the West Bank, their popularity is also going down fast. Both governments are super corrupt. There are a lot of socio-economic problems, as we discussed. West Bank is definitely more stable, but now also this COVID pandemic escalated problems really fast. And this conflict, because for both Fatah and Hamas, it's therefore important to come together, to actually start again about forming a government, to have democratic elections again, as most Palestinians want and are also expecting. But every time when they talk about these elections and when they set a date for new elections, it's delayed. Mostly by this guy, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, Fatah Abbas, who's the president of the Palestinian Authority. And why is he doing that? He also did it a few months before the conflict in May. Why is he doing that? Well, simple. He knows he will lose, probably. So Hamas won in 2006. It will probably now win again. Hamas, of course, very big problems in Gaza, far more problems than we actually realize in Gaza, is angry, very angry. So this conflict, which we saw in May, was very useful to them, and it worked. They proved themselves, because after this conflict escalated, they also started to shoot rockets. They escalated in a full war with Israel. Of course, Israel was very happy to take on that battle. Netanyahu had his own reasons also to do so. We talk about that later on. But Hamas proved itself to the Palestinian people, and even people outside, we are the real defenders of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We are the real resistance against Israel. So it was not even a real attack or a real provocation against Israel, but mostly against Fatah. A big problem for the Palestinians, or at least for the Palestinian Authority, because they know there's a real chance that if nothing changes, that at some point at least Hamas or another radical group will take over. Problem as well for Israel, because, well, they definitely don't want to deal with Hamas. This brings us to Israel, because there we also see a lot of political changes. During the last conflict, Netanyahu was still in power, the prime minister for many years, famous for the status quo, because under Netanyahu, he tried to keep everything the same. He didn't want a solution, he didn't want things to get worse as well, but he tried to focus just on the status quo. Now Israel, well, in my opinion, fortunately, has a new government. It's a government of many different parties. It was very difficult to form a government. If you think the Dutch formation is difficult, well, look at the Israeli politics. It's even more, it's far more complicated. But they managed to do so. And this new government, well, again, in my opinion, it brings some hope. Because this government is, first of all, far more aware that the status quo is not sustainable. They saw the violence in the May war on Israeli streets between Arabs, Israeli Arabs, and Jews. Violence leading to many people getting hurt, property destroyed, and people dying. And they also saw that the Palestinian Authority is weakening. Like I said before, they don't want to deal with Hamas. So they need to strengthen the Palestinian Authority. And this new government is already doing so. So in the last months, we're seeing more and more talks. So it's finally, the Palestinian Authority in Israel, which didn't happen for many years because, well, Netanyahu just wanted to status quo. The Palestinian Authority had its own interests, but they are talking again, finally, to strengthen the Palestinian Authority, to prevent Hamas, of course, from taking over, and hopefully this can be the base eventually for real peace talks. It's far too early to say that is what is happening, because they both claim it's not, but at least they are talking, which is a good step. We also see other developments. We see that Lapid, who will be one of the prime ministers, he's now Minister of Foreign Affairs, is already developing a new vision for Gaza, more economic investments, more economic development. So they are wait and see, but we didn't hear these kinds of talks for many years coming out of Israel. So that is a really, in my opinion, a really good sign. But be careful and be realistic, because Bennett, who is currently the prime minister, very right-wing, he said, under my watch, there will never be a Palestinian country, Palestinian nation. So although we can be a little bit hopeful, not too much. And this brings us to the international dimension, because Israel, the new Israeli government, is also, far more than Netanyahu, far more concerned about its international reputation. The international reputation of Israel is bad, very bad, definitely here in the West. And this is concerning because the conflict with the Palestinians is not the only, the only topic or the only conflict Israel cares about. There's also the conflict with Iran, for example. And if you don't have international support, if other countries, well, we don't like you, and you're also not talking with the Palestinians, then it's also difficult to come to a solution Israel wants for the nuclear problems in Iran. So there's a real incentive here for the new Israeli government to really start working on a solution. There is also, besides the reputational damage, there's also a new look on geopolitical shifts. So we're all familiar with that Israel and the US are close allies, right? This has been the case for many years. It's not taken for granted anymore. First of all, we saw in the last years when Trump was still president that, of course, Netanyahu and Trump were very close. Trump even moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, very sensitive topic. But yeah, this hurted the Israeli reputation very much. But it also showed a little bit, or it seemed to suggest that Israel was taking political sides in US politics. The new US President, Biden, still supportive of Israel, but clearly said, I want to get out of the Middle East, basically, or at least that's what he's suggesting. The move in Afghanistan, which I already heard about, is an example of that. But he also wants to move out of this conflict. They want to get out. Again, this whole alliance support of Israel cannot take for granted that it will always last. For Palestinians, the same problem is there. We talked in the beginning about the Arab support they had, but in the last years we saw Israel, under Netanyahu, sign several peace agreements and investment agreements with the Arab countries. And these are big agreements. These are very warm agreements, leading probably to really improvements in the relations. And those Arab countries, they don't care anymore about, or not at least the governments don't care anymore about what's happening in Palestine. They say, look, we still want to work with you, we still want to get a solution, but work with Israel towards a solution. So we see that this whole shift in geopolitical relations, this whole new dynamic of how countries relate to each other, in my view, it brings hope. It is really an incentive if this new government, which is, like I said, in Israel, is very unstable, but at least it has a new government, but it can lead to new talks. And that is why I'm hopeful that in the coming 5 years, we might see those first steps, because also no one was expecting that Israel would sign those peace agreements. Conclusions? Conclusions? No conclusions? Oh, it seems my computer crashed. Well, yeah, well, I have to do it out of my head. I see it a little bit there. But we see in the beginning this endless cycle of frustration, which is giving more and more space to radical groups on both sides of the spectrum, also causing more and more problems. My second conclusion. The status quo, as we know it, in this endless cycle of frustration, the status quo, as we saw on the map in the beginning, is not sustainable. It eventually will lead to more problems. If it's either the Hamas taking over on Israel, maybe the Israeli side, more extreme groups taking over. We don't know where it's heading to with the settlements. We see that the polarization of the conflict, not just there, but also here, is getting worse. It's forming a blockade or an obstacle to good talks, discussions, open debate, what is possible, where are the emotions from both sides coming from. And at the same time, we have to realize they are both having a right to exist, Israel and Palestine. They are both making mistakes, but they also both have rightful claims. Embracing this complexity, and again, that is my belief, will bring us closer to at least a healthy environment for debate, but also to peace. And that's what we all want. Thank you. Oh, well.
And there they are, the conclusions. Thank you very much, Tjeerd, for discussing this and discussing all these highlights in the short time span you had. We have some time for questions. Maybe there are some questions here in the audience in the room. There's also a question online. Let me first go to the room. I saw are there questions? Not yet. In the back over there. Yes. Yeah, the mic is coming to you and you are audible in the live stream but not visible.
So there have been a number of international attempts through peace summits in Madrid and Oslo and Camp David throughout the years to try and solve this conflict. Do you think that there's an opportunity for that to happen again from an international, more like interventionist perspective, or do you think that it can only happen domestically between Israel and Palestine?
It's a very good question. I actually think, and to be honest, I removed that line because I wanted to say so much, but I removed it from an earlier version of my presentation. But peace has actually been close in the past many times. because of many interests from both abroad and within those countries, it didn't happen. But we don't realize it that often. But peace, also before even Israel was created, peace has been there quite a lot, almost at least. I believe the incentive for what you're saying here, for this agreement to come to peace or come closer together, will come from the region. So I really believe that those Arab nations who still, they want to grow closer to Israel. Some of them are already doing it, but they also know we still have to be careful. And it's really important for us, particularly the Arab countries, that Israel and the Palestinians come to a peace solution, and then we can form one bigger bloc against similar threats. We can work together on economic diversification, which is for them a really important incentive, because we are nearing the end of those traditional energy sources, which are so important for those countries. And Israel is an important player also for the American economy to cooperate there and to come together in regional form to a peace solution. So I believe that is what is going to happen in the next 5 years, really from the region, which is a positive sign. And that also shows that doesn't always have to come. We don't always have to look at what is the US doing. They will still have a role. But what is the US doing? What is Europe doing? Let the region together come to a solution. I believe that is what could happen.
Okay, thank you for your question. There's also a question online, Tjeerd. And the question is, do you think democracy is possible in Palestine? And there is a second question related. Is there an Arab country with democracy?
What is the second question?
Is there an Arab country with democracy?
An Arab country with democracy? Well, look, I know where this question is heading to, because often we hear Israel, right, is the only democracy in the Middle East. I mean, democracy is always a work in progress, and I know that's a cliche, but these countries are working, and we see the progress. I mean, the Arab Spring, for example, was also a clear reaction of the Arab people. We want to be more represented. We want to be more included in our governments, which is a positive sign. So yes, I mean, most of these Arab countries are definitely not there yet. Maybe countries like Tunisia or something are the best examples of democracy currently, but it is happening. It's work in progress, and yes, that is possible. It will take time, but it will happen. Also in the Arab countries, in their own way. It doesn't have to be democracy as we know it. I have no idea how the Arab countries want to organize it themselves. It can take many years. It can take shortly, but it will happen. Will it happen in Palestine? Yes, for sure. It has common struggles, but Palestine, also the sense of Palestinian nationhood is very young. They're still developing. Those extreme groups, those fights for democracy, we had that as well here in Europe. We also have bloody wars over democracy. And in Palestine, at least, well, they can now together, hopefully now also with Israel, with other countries there in the region, they can quicker, without a lot of bloodshed, can come to a real democracy. So if I believe it's possible, 100%, yes.
Okay, that's hopeful. Thank you. Is there another question here in the audience? Then raise your hand and the mic will come to you. Yes, here in the front.
The solution is peace, but what's your definition of peace in this case? What does peace really mean in this case?
Well, I don't know if the solution is peace, but the end goal is peace. Basically, in my sense, is two states, two nation states, Israel, and I do believe Israel has to be a Jewish state. We cannot have a solution where Israel is not a Jewish state. And Palestine as a Palestinian national state with both Gaza and the Westbank. I don't know how it exactly will look like on geographical terms, because there is a lot of negotiation going on land exchange. Will some settlements be included or not? But not what, for example, Ariel Sharon had in mind. So when he built that wall, when he started to move all the settlements out, just in a unilateral peace with the Palestinian nation completely isolated from Israel, but two countries working together in a bigger framework also of regional cooperation, towards economic prosperity for all. That is what peace is.
Okay, thank you. Well, time is up for this main part, but there are still questions online, I can see. Maybe there are also still some questions here in the audience. But we have to wrap up this main part. So, Tjeerd, for now, thank you very much for your talk and answering these questions. So, give Tjeerd, please, a warm applause. And well, we can go on with answering questions till 20 to 2. So if you have to leave for class or something else, you can leave the room now. But if you would like to stay and to hear more about this topic and ask your questions, feel free. For the bachelor students who are watching online, the link to the registration form for the youth registration will appear in the chat. Nee. And we can go on with answering questions here.
Yeah. While I'm watching this dramatic.
Yeah, but there are also people still watching online. So, Tjeerd, there's a question, and the question is: are there interests of other nations to maintain conflict in the region? For instance, to maintain military bases in the region.
To maintain, what was the last?
Military bases in the
Operations.
Region. Bases. So the
Occupation. Well, I don't hear the last word.
The bases in the region. Yeah.
Oh, bases.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Yes. Well, that's what was also a really big part of the problem here for many decades, is that Israel and Palestine, of course, were also in the aim or in the angle of other countries. We saw it with Palestine throughout the years, with the Arab countries who had a big interest in keeping this conflict alive, also for the domestic purposes. The Israel-Palestine conflict in Arab states, well, was really important as a flag, as a symbol, to also justify their own kind of dictatorships. They say, look, we'll focus there, let's make Israel, that's also what happened, Israel into a scapegoat. And this is how we can justify our own autocratic rule. But these became, of course, they started to change. Now we see that still happening in some countries. So, for example, we see in Turkey, even Iran are still using, and maybe also some other Arab states, still using Israel as a still very powerful symbol. As long as that conflict goes on, we need to unite together, or we are the real defenders of the Palestinian cause against imperialists, against Israel, against whatever they want to name it. So yeah, that is definitely what is happening. On the other side, on the Israel side, are there still, well, at the moment, I think less on the Israel side. I mean, they are allies. So, for example, we see in the United States that under the current Biden administration, they want to focus on that Asia theater. They want to focus on the trade war with China, and that's what they want to spend their resources on, not in endless wars, as Biden literally said, in the Middle East. So from the Western side, the perspective to really move towards an end goal here, to work towards peace, is more there. Or at least they care so little that eventually they will just move out without a peace negotiation, but they don't really want to keep the conflict going on.
Okay.
Yeah, that's positive. Well, on that side at least.
Yeah. Okay. Someone else here in the audience. Yeah, there's a question here in the front. Lisa, if you can come with the mic.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the presentation. I just want to ask regarding the two-state solution. As you mentioned previously, there has been a time prior to all of this where the region was held by a single entity, whether it was the Ottomans or the British. Can you briefly explain why a single-state solution doesn't really make sense in the modern world?
It's more about, this is also, and for at least from the Israeli perspective, it's also an emotional point of view. So the whole Zionism cause started really as a reaction to what was happening, of course, in Europe. So we see there Jews were persecuted for many centuries. They didn't see, I'm generalizing now, but shortening the whole history, but they didn't really see a future for themselves in Europe, and they wanted to have their own country. In the end, it didn't have to be just there in Palestine or in Israel, but this is where it came to be. And they felt, after all those years of feeling insecure, of feeling unsafe, of being threatened, of being persecuted, they felt the only place where we can be safe is to have our own state. So it has to be a Jewish state for their side. So Israel will never give up that cause to have at least have a Jewish state. So if that one state solution is where there is a Jewish state, then it's possible. But the Palestinians will, of course, never want that. They will never want to live in something that's just a Jewish state. They also want to have a Palestinian state. So to have these emotions, completely justifiable emotions for both sides, that is why a one-state solution will never happen, because Israel will never, and there are so millions and millions of Palestinians they would have then to allow into one bigger state. Yeah, you cannot really sustain a Jewish state like that. And that is what Zionism in the end, as really having that plight to form a safe place for Jews all over the world. This is why a one-state solution from the Israeli point of view at least will never happen. And I also don't think that in the end Palestinians really want that. Yeah.
But also looking at the two-state solution, a big problem in there is Jerusalem, because the center of Jerusalem plays a very important part in.
An enormous, that is a huge point of conflict, of course. So Jerusalem is important to both sides. The international community wants them to share it. That's the most logical, measure, but that's easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in a city with so much tensions, to keep it safe, to make sure they can all live together, but also with the different nationalities, how are you going to organize that? How are you going to arrange that? So,
and especially the Temple Mountain, which is the religious center.
Exactly. Well, you saw it on the first map. But you see, let's say you have a little bit the circle, which is the old city. Then you have West Jerusalem, where many of the Israeli live, and then you have East Jerusalem, where most Palestinians live. And you see that currently there is it's on full Israel control, and they want to keep it that way. And that is a problem. Jerusalem is a big problem. So where I say yes, a two-state solution should definitely be there, but I also believe a shared capital should be there, and Israel is definitely not working towards a shared capital. And that's a problem, because what are you going to do with those 200,000, I thought 200,000 or 300,000 Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem? What are you going to do then with them? You are not going to give them Israel citizenship. I don't think they will do that. So what? Are they becoming refugees in your own country? That's a clear problem. Yeah. So there is that's also an important part of this conflict. If you have a two-state solution, it has to be a shared capital, with East Jerusalem as the Palestinian capital, West Jerusalem as the Israeli capital, and the old city completely shared. Okay,
that's a clear vision. There is a question in the chat. The question is not totally clear to me, but let me just ask it. And the question is, isn't Israel helping the Palestinian Authority also against democracy, as the people from Palestine do not want the Palestinian minister to be in power?
Yes. Well, I mean, the problem here is, of course, what I also said during the presentation, Hamas is probably going to win every election that is going to happen now. So if you allow that, I'm not saying they're preventing the whole election scheme, but if you allow that from simply going on, then Hamas will also take over on the West Bank. And that is definitely not in the interest of Israel, definitely not in the interest of the Palestinian Authority. That's different from saying that Israel is actively working against democracy, because Israel is also has worked with Israel towards setting up these elections. They also feel, well, we are not really safe as long as Hamas is on control of Gaza. So we have to somehow pacify Hamas into a more... Fatah also started as a really more radical group or more rebel group. But we somehow have to pacify Hamas into becoming this kind of Fatah, basically, and so that they together in this democratic process can form a real government that is good for both sides.
Yeah, so and there is also a follow-up question here. Then do you think that organizations like Hamas will be replaced by more peaceful organizations in time? Or will Israel have to learn to negotiate with the Gaza terror?
Well, I mean, you cannot really negotiate with terror groups, but I do believe that for Hamas, it's really important to indeed eventually lay down their weapons. These developments have going on for quite a while. So we see in Gaza, for example, there are even far more radical groups at the moment than Hamas, who try to fight Hamas even. So Hamas really is trying to keep that under check. And in the end, they probably will also need support of the Palestinian Authority and of Israel to keep that, and Egypt to keep that, to keep their position. In the end, they also want to have the power, basically. This is how normally these situations start. And Hamas has a problem, because Hamas is, or was started also as part of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were, during the Egyptian revolution, very supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they completely lost a few years ago in that Arab Spring. They completely lost support of Egypt. And by losing support of Egypt, well, they were standing on themselves. So they're very dependent now on these bigger powers. And hopefully that somehow will develop them into becoming more, more peaceful, more
And also the new organizations that
more like a normal political group. And this is definitely which could happen, and this would hopefully also will also happen, hopefully.
Okay. Someone else here in the audience, yes. The mic is there.
Do you find any resemblance between this conflict and the conflict happening between Serbia and Kosovo?
Between Serbia and Kosovo, I have to say I'm not expert enough on Serbia and Kosovo to really make a good statement of that. I normally don't think about that in terms of similarity. Let me quickly recap on Serbia and Kosovo. But
or maybe you would like to share your vision on that?
Yeah, maybe that's better.
Shortly.
Yeah.
I think that advancement in this conflict on Palestine and Israel could also affect the results of the Serbian-Kosovo conflict. And that's why I was asking for, what do you think about this?
And why do you think that?
Well, because I see there are both similarities in this case, because it's one occupation force and one force which is already saying, I live in here. And both were permitted by using force. Well, in case of Kosovo, they got the support of NATO. But for Palestine, that's not the case. But you can see a bit the resemblance between them.
Yeah,
I think.
No, that's. I think it's very interesting, because you normally see how people around the world also in conflict. You also see it in Armenia and Azerbaijan with Nagorno-Karabakh. You see, and other conflicts as well, how people are starting to say we feel very connected to either side in this conflict, because the conflict is so similar. And although I understand these emotions, and I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm saying I understand these emotions, be careful there, because in the end, there are two very different conflicts, and they will be very complex with very different causes, with very different developments, very different parties involved. And sometimes it does explain geopolitical relations between those countries or their allies, but try, and that's so important, and that's also something I try to underline today, but really see the uniqueness and the unique complexity of each conflict there.
Okay, thank you for your question. I was wondering, you are hopeful, but now and then we see big escalations. And I was wondering that in the end, could an escalation like we had in May lead in the end to a third world war, maybe, if also the USA and Iran and China and Russia are involved? Do you think that's a way it can go?
I think it has become now, definitely with the Arab countries making arrangements with Israel, I think it has become far less likely for that to happen. For that said, then we have to more look to countries like Iran or maybe Turkey, how they will use this conflict. Latest developments with Turkey, for example, is that also Turkey is starting. They feel a little bit isolated at the moment, don't really have that support to make it into a bigger war. And we see them also starting to re-establish relations with Israel and the new government, so that's hopeful. Iran, completely different case, but still Iran is also quite isolated, doesn't have a lot of support internationally. They do have different factions around Israel, which again, for Israel, insecurity is not just Palestinians. It's also with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is very close to Iran. Other Shiite groups or pro-Iranian groups in Syria and so on. So yeah, it could definitely use those groups to attack Israel, which I am very concerned about. I don't think it will become a bigger world war. It's not in the interest of America, Europe, etc. China, too far from their bed. But what I'm very concerned about is this Lebanon-Syria case. Lebanon is becoming very fragile at the moment. We see Lebanon economically, but also politically, falling apart quickly. Hezbollah, which is Shiite and pro-Iranian, is very strong. Many rockets pointed towards Israel. They don't have at the moment a real interest to attack Israel. But if that war escalates, then we have a real problem. Yeah. Then, well, I don't say we have a real problem, but the world, the region at least, will have a real problem. Yeah.
Okay, Tjeerd, thank you very much for giving your talk and sharing all these insights with us, with the people here in the room, but also with the people watching online. Thank you. Thank you all for being here and watching online, and hope to see you next week at another lecture, or maybe tonight. We have also theater and film and other things coming up, so hope to see you then. Bye-bye.